Lucy Kong had always been a quiet, introspective girl. Raised by her single mother in a small town in Northern California, she had learned to be self-reliant and cautious. Her mother had always told her stories about her father, whom Lucy had never met, but it didn't bother her much. She had grown used to his absence, filling her world with her friends, work, and her love of reading. But recently, something unsettling had entered her life. Carl. Carl worked the night shifts at the same cafe as Lucy. He was a tall, gaunt man with pale skin and dark, sunken eyes. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. What unnerved Lucy most about him wasn't his appearance, but the way he would stare at her. Long, piercing stares that seemed to suck the air out of the room. There was something about his presence, a heaviness that made her skin crawl whenever she was near him. It was as though she could feel his aura creeping up on her. Even when he wasn't looking her way, the feeling of unease would grip her, tightening like a rope around her chest, making it hard to breathe. One late evening, after finishing her shift, Lucy felt an intense hunger gnawing at her. She had forgotten to eat dinner, and the corner diner down the street from her apartment made the best burgers in town. The thought of sinking her teeth into one made her stomach rumble, but there was a voice in the back of her mind, a gut feeling warning her not to go out that night. For a moment, she hesitated at the door of her apartment, key in hand. Her instincts told her to stay inside. She couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling. But hunger won over caution, and she brushed off the unease. "I'm just being paranoid," she muttered to herself. "It's only a couple of blocks away." She slipped on her jacket and stepped out into the night. The streets were unusually quiet for a Friday. The air was thick with a chilly fog that made everything seem more isolated, more distant. As Lucy walked, her footsteps echoed in the empty street. It was then she felt it, an eerie sensation of being watched, like eyes were following her every move. She quickened her pace, her heart beginning to thump in her chest. Then, from the corner of her eye, she spotted something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A black van. It was parked across the street with its engine running, but no one was inside. The windows were tinted, giving off an ominous reflection of the dim streetlights above. Lucy's stomach tightened. The feeling of dread she had brushed off earlier came rushing back, this time stronger than ever. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around and run, but instead, she forced herself to keep walking, this time faster, her hands stuffed in her pockets, her eyes glued to the pavement in front of her. With every step, she felt the presence of the van growing closer, like a shadow creeping behind her, even though it stayed parked. The street felt too empty, too silent, as if the world around her had been swallowed up. Her heart raced, and she dared not look back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was near. As she approached the diner, she reached for the door, but her fingers trembled. She glanced back down the street, and there it was, the black van, now parked closer than before, its engine still running. She froze. Had it moved? Was someone watching her from inside? Her breath quickened. She fumbled with the door, finally pushing it open and stepping into the warmth of the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly. The safety of the brightly lit room calmed her nerves, but only for a moment. She turned to glance out the window, but the van was gone. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Lucy sat in the booth, her appetite now gone, her mind racing. Who was in the van? Had she imagined the whole thing? Or worse, was it Carl? His intense stares, the way his presence always made her feel like he was lurking, waiting for something. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She didn't eat that night. Instead, she left the diner quickly, checking her surroundings the entire way back to her apartment. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in her head. When she finally reached her apartment, she locked the door behind her and collapsed onto her bed, her mind replaying the events of the night. Sleep didn't come easily. The next day at work, Carl was there, sitting in the corner, staring. His eyes never left her, and when their gazes met, his lips curled into a smile, a cold, knowing smile that made Lucy's blood run cold. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Little did Lucy know, that black van wasn't just a coincidence. It was the beginning of something far more sinister, and soon, she would discover secrets about her father. Secrets that would pull her deeper into a mystery she never asked for, but one that had been waiting for her all along. Lucy stepped outside the cafe for her break, hoping the crisp afternoon air would help calm her nerves. She leaned against the wall, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had been clinging to her since last night. Her mind wandered back to the black van, the strange presence she felt, and the way it disappeared so suddenly. Just as she took a deep breath, she froze. Carl was standing across the street, staring at her with that same creepy, unblinking gaze. His lips parted into a sickening smile, revealing his yellowed, uneven teeth. His hand rose slowly, waving at her with long, bony fingers caked in dirt. His fingernails were filthy, almost black from the grime embedded beneath them. Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She looked away, refusing to meet his gaze any longer. The unease swelled inside her like a storm, and she felt her body go stiff with fear. Why was he watching her? What did he want? Without another glance, Lucy turned and walked back inside the cafe, her pace quickening as her thoughts spiraled. Last night's events loomed large in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that Carl's presence wasn't a coincidence. She tried to push the fear down, but it clung to her like a heavy weight. After her break, Lucy returned to the counter, trying to lose herself in the steady rhythm of taking orders and making coffee. But as she reached for a cup, something caught her eye. A folded piece of paper tucked neatly beside the cash register. It had her name on it. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she picked it up. Slowly, she unfolded the note and read the message scrawled in messy handwriting. "How's your mother?" Her breath hitched in her throat. Her mother? Why would Carl, or anyone, mention her mother? Panic surged through her, and her mind began to race. How did he know about her mother? Did he know where she lived? Was he watching her too? Lucy looked around frantically, hoping to catch a glimpse of Carl, but he was nowhere to be seen. She rushed over to her co-workers, her voice unsteady. "Did anyone see Carl? Did he leave already?" she asked, her words spilling out in a rush. Her co-workers exchanged confused glances before one of them spoke. "Yeah, his shift ended about half an hour ago." "Why? What's going on?" Lucy didn't respond right away, her heart pounding in her chest. Her boss, a kind older woman named Karen, noticed her distress and approached her gently. "Lucy, are you okay? You seem really shaken up. Do you need to go home?" Lucy swallowed hard and nodded. I think I need to leave early. I'm not feeling well." Karen furrowed her brow, clearly concerned. "Of course, take the rest of the day off if you need. Do you want me to call someone for you? You don't look too good." "No, I'll be okay," Lucy mumbled, forcing a weak smile. She needed to get out of there. She couldn't think straight with all the questions swirling in her mind. The mention of her mother, Carl's creepy smile, the van last night, it was all too much. As she grabbed her things and headed for the door, Lucy could feel the weight of the note pressing down on her. What did Carl want with her? And why did he know about her mother? Was he just trying to scare her, or was something much darker going on? Her hands shook as she dialed her mother's number, hoping and praying she would pick up quickly. Lucy's hands trembled as she pressed the phone to her ear, listening anxiously as it rang. She felt like her heart would leap out of her chest until finally, her mother answered. "Lucy, honey, what's wrong?" Her mother's voice came through, calm but concerned. Lucy let out a deep sigh of relief, her voice shaky but urgent. "Mom, something's been happening. There's this guy at work. His name is Carl, and he's been watching me. Last night there was a van, and today, I got this creepy note. I think he's following me. I'm scared, Mom." Her mother listened intently as Lucy rushed through her words, her worry growing by the second. Lucy was pacing in her apartment, heading toward the door to lock it, just as she felt the air shift behind her. In a split second, before she could react, a large hand with a cloth covered her mouth. The sickly sweet smell of chemicals filled her nostrils, and Lucy's world began to blur. Her phone slipped from her hand as darkness closed in. "Lucy! Lucy!" Her mother's voice called out from the phone, now lying on the floor. On the other end, her mother, Crystal, was panicking. She could hear the muffled sounds of a struggle before the line went disturbingly silent. "Lucy, answer me. Who's there? What do you want with my daughter?" she screamed, her heart racing, fear tightening in her chest. Then, a voice came through the phone, low and menacing. "You know me, Crystal." Crystal's blood ran cold. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was unmistakable, one she thought she'd left behind a long time ago, one she had hoped would never resurface. Dead silence filled the space between them. "Carl," she whispered, her voice barely audible, fear seeping into her every word. She had tried to bury the memories, but they flooded back all at once. The man on the phone wasn't just some stranger tormenting her daughter. He was someone from Crystal's past, a dangerous man with secrets she had never shared with Lucy. He had always been obsessed with her, and now he was targeting her daughter. "What do you want?" Crystal asked, her voice trembling, fighting to stay calm. Her mind raced with desperate thoughts of how to save Lucy. There was a chilling laugh on the other end. "You know exactly what I want. It's time to pay for what you did, Crystal. Don't worry. Lucy's just the beginning." Tears welled up in Crystal's eyes as she gripped the phone, fear and guilt tearing at her. She knew this day might come, but she had hoped against hope that Carl would never return. Now, her daughter was in danger because of her past. Lucy's head throbbed as she slowly regained consciousness. Her body felt heavy, and as her eyes fluttered open, the darkness around her came into focus. The air was damp, and a musty smell filled her nose. She tried to sit up, her heart pounding, but what she saw made her blood run cold. All around her were photos. Photos of herself. Some were from when she was a little girl, others more recent. They lined the walls of the room, staring back at her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. How did he have these? Why were they here? Before she could make sense of it, a deep, eerie voice broke the silence. "So you're awake," the voice said, followed by a disturbing, inhuman laugh that sent shivers down her spine. Lucy whipped her head toward the sound, her stomach knotting with fear. From the shadows, Carl emerged, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. His yellow teeth gleamed in the dim light as he stepped closer. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her want to recoil. "How is my little girl doing?" Carl said, his voice dripping with mock affection. Lucy blinked, her confusion growing. "Little girl," she echoed, her voice shaky. Carl's grin widened, and he laughed again, a chilling, hollow sound. "You don't know, do you? You don't know who your father is. You've never met him, right? What kind of man doesn't meet his own daughter?" Lucy's mind was spinning. What was he talking about? Why was he bringing up her father now? She hadn't ever thought about him. Her mother had always refused to speak of him. But why would Carl care? "What are you trying to say, Carl?" she asked, her voice tense, her heart pounding in her chest. Carl's expression darkened, and for a moment, the playful cruelty in his eyes turned to anger. "I could have been your father," he growled, his voice rising. "If she hadn't cheated on me, if she hadn't betrayed me, I would have been the one to raise you. I would have given you everything. But no, your mother ruined that. She threw it all away. And for what? Some other man." Lucy's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. This couldn't be real. He couldn't be serious. Her mother had never mentioned anything about Carl. Could it be true? Was he really supposed to be her father? "You're lying," Lucy said, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're just trying to scare me." Carl's twisted smile returned, and he leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. "Oh, sweet Lucy, it's no lie. Your mother was mine once. We were supposed to be a family, but she betrayed me, and now I'm going to make sure she pays. And you're part of that payment." Lucy felt a wave of nausea hit her. Her skin crawled under Carl's gaze, and every instinct told her to run, to fight, to get out of this nightmare. But she was trapped, and the truth, whatever it was, hung over her like a heavy shadow, suffocating her. "You're not my father," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling, trying to hold on to the last shred of hope. "You're not." Carl chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "You'll find out soon enough, little girl. But first, let's see how well you can handle the truth. Your mother's lies have kept you safe for too long. Now, it's time you see things the way they really are." Lucy's heart raced as Carl turned his back to her, the darkness swallowing him again, leaving her alone with a horrifying revelation he'd just dropped. As Lucy was trapped, grappling with the dark truths Carl had revealed, her mother, Crystal, was pacing frantically in her home, her fingers trembling as she clutched her phone. She had called the police as soon as she realized Lucy had been taken. "Please, you have to help me. It's Carl. Carl Richard. He's taken my daughter." Crystal cried, her voice desperate. On the other end of the line, The officer paused for a moment. "Carl?" he asked, a hint of recognition in his voice. "Yes," Crystal replied urgently. "Carl Richard. Do you know him?" The officer's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "Let me make sure we're talking about the same person. You said Carl Richard?" "Yes. Yes, that's him," Crystal shouted, panic rising in her voice. "He's dangerous, please. He's already taken her." There was a tense silence as the officer exchanged glances with another officer nearby. They stepped aside, and Crystal could hear faint murmurs as they spoke quietly to each other. Her heart pounded as every second dragged by, fear gnawing at her. She could barely make out the officer saying something about Carl's history. A minute later, the officer came back to the phone. "Ma'am, we're going to file a missing person report right away," he said, his voice firm but with an undertone of caution. "We'll send units to investigate and search for your daughter." Crystal didn't understand why they were being so careful with their words. "You know who he is, don't you?" she asked, her voice breaking. "He's done something before, hasn't he?" The officer hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Yes, ma'am. Carl Richard has a long history with the law. He's been involved in violent incidents and, well, he's been on our radar for years. But we haven't had any active leads on him until now. He's been laying low." Crystal's knees nearly gave out as she heard the officer's words. She clung to the counter for support. She had known Carl was dangerous. She had known that when she left him all those years ago, but she never imagined he would resurface like this, targeting her daughter. "Please," Crystal whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Find her. He's unhinged. I don't know what he's going to do, but he's not in his right mind." "We're going to do everything we can," the officer assured her. "We're already dispatching officers to your area, and we're treating this as urgent." As Crystal hung up the phone, she felt a deep, gnawing pit in her stomach. Carl had always been trouble, but the fact that the police recognized his name so quickly made it clear this was far more dangerous than she'd ever realized. She thought back to the things Carl had said over the years, the threats he had made, the anger that always simmered just below the surface. And now, all that rage was directed at Lucy. Crystal's heart ached as she realized that her past had come back to haunt her in the worst possible way. The man she thought she had escaped from was back, and this time, he wouldn't stop until he had taken everything from her. With shaking hands, Crystal grabbed her keys, determined to do whatever it took to save her daughter. She couldn't just wait for the police. Carl was too unpredictable, too dangerous. If they didn't find Lucy soon, Crystal feared that Carl's twisted mind would lead him to do something unspeakable. Lucy's heart raced as Carl's footsteps faded into the distance. She sat on a cold, hard chair in the middle of a small, dimly lit room surrounded by the oppressive presence of trees outside. The walls of the cabin were crude, almost like they had been hastily put together. Her hands were tied, but she wasn't bound to the chair. If she could just find a way to loosen the ropes or slip out unnoticed, she might have a chance. "What are you going to do to me, Carl?" she had asked moments earlier, her voice trembling with fear. Carl's face had twisted into a sick grin as he leaned in, his breath hot and rancid on her skin. "I'm going to take everything away from your mom like she did to me," he had snarled, eyes gleaming with manic energy. Lucy's stomach churned as she recalled the conversation. Carl was obsessed with some warped idea of revenge, and now she was the one trapped in his demented plan. He wanted to punish her mother by hurting her, but how far would he go? She swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. When Carl had slammed the table, demanding she eat, her pulse had spiked. His sudden mood swings terrified her. One second he was laughing, the next, he was on the verge of snapping. She had no idea what he was capable of. Now, as he disappeared into the trees, Lucy knew she had to act quickly. Her hands strained against the rope, the coarse fibers digging into her skin as she wriggled her wrists. Her mind was racing, trying to map out her surroundings. There was the door Carl had left through, and the windows, though they were covered in grime and barely let in any light. The room itself was sparse, just the table, her chair, and some discarded items on the floor. Her breath quickened as she spotted a small knife lying near a pile of junk on the floor. It looked dull, but it was her only hope. Glancing nervously at the door, she cautiously leaned forward, stretching her body as far as she could, her fingers just barely grazing the handle of the knife. She prayed Carl wouldn't return too soon. As her fingertips hooked around the knife, she managed to pull it toward her. Her heart pounded in her ears as she sawed at the ropes, her hands trembling with the effort. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the ropes loosened, and she slipped her hands free. A surge of relief washed over her, but she knew she wasn't safe yet. She had to get out of there before Carl came back. Her eyes darted to the window. Could she break it and escape? Or should she try the door and risk running into him outside? Her mind was racing, weighing her options, but there was no time to hesitate. She knew she had to move now, while Carl was still gone. Lucy's heart skipped a beat when Carl came back into the room, casually saying, "I forgot my keys." She froze, her mind racing. She had just freed her hands but didn't want him to notice. Keeping her posture relaxed, she rested her arms as if they were still tied. Carl started looking around the small room, searching for his keys. Lucy's eyes darted to a large photo album sitting on the table. She could see pictures of herself as a child alongside recent ones of her mother. Why does he have these? She thought, feeling a growing unease. Carl seemed distracted, but he glanced around, his gaze briefly resting on the floor near where the knife lay. Lucy kept her breathing steady, hoping he wouldn't connect the dots. He gave her a brief look, but then he seemed more focused on finding his keys. Lucy's heart raced, but she remained still, acting as though nothing was out of place. She knew she had to stay calm. After a few tense moments, Carl finally found his keys on the table. He gave her a strange smile, then said, "I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere." His tone was light, but it sent a shiver down Lucy's spine. As soon as he stepped out, her instincts kicked in. She quietly stood, ready to leave while he was distracted outside. Taking a deep breath, Lucy carefully slipped out of the cabin, trying not to make a sound. She didn't know where she was, but she knew she had to get as far away from Carl as possible before he noticed she was gone. Lucy's heart raced as she whispered to herself, "My phone." She frantically looked around the room, unable to find it. Panic surged through her, but something urged her to check Carl's room. Quietly, she slipped down the hall and peeked inside. To her relief, there it was, sitting on his bed. She grabbed the phone quickly, but as she headed for the door, she froze. The sound of Carl's car pulling up outside made her heart drop. She backed away, her mind racing. Carl's voice soon echoed through the house, angry and frantic. "Where are you?" he yelled, his footsteps stomping through the front door. Lucy's fear took over. She couldn't go back out the way she came. Her eyes darted to the window in Carl's room. Without a second thought, she quietly unlocked it and slipped outside, trying not to make any noise. The cool air hit her face as she lowered herself out, her heart pounding in her ears. Once her feet hit the ground, she ran. She didn't look back, the only sound being the crunch of leaves beneath her as she sprinted through the woods, desperate to put as much distance between herself and Carl as possible. As Lucy ran, Carl's voice echoed through the night, calling her name in a frantic, menacing tone. The sound sent chills down her spine, making her feel like she was trapped in a horror movie. She pushed herself harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to block out the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. After what felt like hours of running through the dark woods, she finally stumbled upon a small clearing. Exhausted and dirty from her frantic escape, Lucy's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed onto the ground, her body too worn out to go any further. A passing bystander noticed her lying there, looking disheveled and frightened. They rushed over and knelt beside her, quickly checking to see if she was okay. Realizing she was unconscious, the kind stranger pulled out their phone and dialed the police, explaining the situation and requesting help. When the sirens finally broke the silence of the night, Lucy began to stir, groggily opening her eyes to see the flashing lights illuminating the darkness. Relief washed over her as she realized she was no longer alone. She had escaped Carl, and help was finally here. As Lucy lay in the hospital bed, she slowly regained her strength. The bright lights above her felt overwhelming, but she was grateful to be alive and safe. She had just closed her eyes when her mother, Crystal, received a call from law enforcement. "Miss Kong," the officer said gently, "we have found your daughter, and she's safe. She's at the hospital, and you can come to see her." Crystal's heart soared with relief. "Thank you. I'll be there right away." She quickly gathered her things and rushed out of her house, her mind racing with worry and hope for her daughter's well-being. When Crystal arrived at the hospital, the bright fluorescent lights and sterile smell filled her with anxiety. She hurried to the front desk, where a nurse directed her to Lucy's room. As she approached the door, She could hear the soft beeping of the machines and the faint sound of her daughter's voice. Pushing the door open, Crystal rushed inside. "Lucy!" she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. Lucy looked up, her eyes widening with surprise and relief. "Mom!" Lucy exclaimed, tears welling up in her eyes. Crystal ran to her, enveloping her in a tight embrace. They held each other, the weight of fear and anxiety lifting slightly as they were finally reunited. "I was so scared," Crystal said, her voice shaky. "I thought I'd lost you." "I'm okay, Mom," Lucy reassured her, though she couldn't shake the memories of the terrifying ordeal. "I escaped." As they sat together, the bond between them strengthened, and Lucy knew she was safe with her mother by her side. Crystal vowed to protect her daughter and to ensure that they would face whatever came next together. After a while, a police officer entered Lucy's hospital room, accompanied by a detective. They introduced themselves and asked if they could talk to her about what happened. Lucy nodded, her heart still racing from the memories of her ordeal. As she recounted the events, she tried to stay focused, despite the overwhelming emotions. "I was working, and then Carl. He just kept watching me. I didn't think much of it at first," she explained, her voice trembling. "But then he took me. I don't really know where I was. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere." One of the officers leaned in, concern etched on his face. "Do you remember the location at all? Any landmarks or roads?" Lucy bit her lip, searching her memory. "I kind of remember where I passed out. It was near some trees, and I think I saw a cabin in the distance. But that's all I can remember." The detective scribbled notes, nodding. "Every detail helps. Did you notice anything else about the area? Anything that stood out?" Lucy thought hard, trying to visualize the moment. "There were a lot of trees, and it was really dark. I just remember running and then everything went black." "Thank you, Lucy," the officer said gently. "You've been very brave. We'll do our best to find Carl and make sure he can't hurt you or anyone else again." As they left, Lucy felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She had shared her story, but the fear of what lay ahead still lingered in her mind. With her mother by her side, she hoped for safety and closure, knowing they would face the future together. The next day, Lucy woke up in her hospital bed, the bright morning light streaming through the window. As she turned her head, she was startled to see Carl's face on the television screen. The news anchor reported that he had been caught, his capture becoming a headline that filled her with a mix of relief and dread. Lucy listened as the reporter detailed how law enforcement had tracked him down thanks to her description and the evidence they had gathered. "He is now in custody, facing multiple charges," the anchor said, and Lucy felt a weight lift from her chest. Hours later, some of her co-workers from the cafe came to visit. Lucy smiled weakly, grateful for their support. They gathered around her bed, their expressions a mix of concern and sympathy. Her boss, a tall woman with a worried frown, stepped forward. "Lucy, I am so sorry for everything that happened. I should have never hired him. He came in right after I hired you, and I didn't think much of it at the time," she said, shaking her head regretfully. "It's not your fault," Lucy replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't know. But I should have done a better job screening employees. I'm just glad you're safe," her boss continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "If there's anything you need, just let us know. We're all here for you." Lucy felt a surge of gratitude for her co-workers' support. They shared stories and memories from work, trying to bring some lightness to the heavy atmosphere. While Lucy appreciated their kindness, a part of her remained anxious, her mind still replaying the events of the past few days. As they left, Lucy lay back in her bed, contemplating her next steps. With Carl in custody, she hoped to find a sense of normalcy again, though she knew it would take time to heal. For now, she felt grateful to be surrounded by love and support, knowing she wouldn't have to face this alone.